Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we are talking with Aubrey Wade and TJ Mead about transitioning our business continuity roles to a more technical role. Guys, great first segment there. There's something I'd like to ask you now, and that is, what's the key differences between business continuity and ITDR, considering we're all supposed to be working together?
Yeah, that
I'd like to go
that
first.
that can be a loaded question. I hate using this term, but it per particular organization. I've seen companies where ITDR is in IT, like specifically under IT or engineering, and BC is somewhere else in the company. It's under risk, it's under human resources. I've seen it under finance, like it's somewhere else in the business, and very seldomly do they speak. But then I've seen other organizations where they're plugged together and under the same umbrella. So um, it depends on those relationships. But from an ITDR perspective, I will say that those folks are typically dealing directly with engineers most of the time. There is some business involvement to better understand what the business's needs are um, from an IT recovery perspective. But again, that depends a little bit on how close you are to the BC team. So if you're really far apart and you don't talk to each other very much, there's more load on the ITDR team because they need to do more interfacing with the business. When you're closer together and communicating better, then you're getting signal directly from the BIA or whatever process analysis you're using from the BC team telling you like, hey, here's the business needs for the IT systems that you need to ensure recovery for.
Aubrey?
Agreed. I mean, I've seen both, and I think TJ, like exactly what you've seen in terms of informing the requirements for ITDR performance and recovery and how close they're to the business. Sometimes you'll be talking to the ITDR team, and the most knowledge they have of kind of the business need is coming from the application support team, which is who yells louder about things being down. And it's not always informed directly by a risk rating or an impact analysis. I'll also say one of the big differences I notice is kind of the way you talk about different losses. So, a loss of facility for a business could be the building, office space, printers, things like that. For IT, it's usually a data center or servers, which then has a technology immediate impact. So, or if it's staff, you might be thinking, oh, the process employee who does fulfillment and stuffs envelopes. In ITDR, it could be a single point of failure, the only person who has credentials to do a certain thing. So, you have a lot more of that kind of factored into this. And I think just the way you think about the way things go down has a larger impact because ultimately it ends up impacting technology. Even if you look at those different loss types, loss of vendor can also be a loss of data center. And that is a huge part of ITDR considerations while you're building a program. And I'm not just talking about like public cloud, like the big boys. I think was it 3 years ago, Sixtera declared Chapter 11, and everybody got in kind of a tizzy about the fact that this data center lease company was maybe going out of business. And like that's another thing you have to think about, which are you going to pick up servers and move them? Um, and then the last one I was going to go into is supply chain. When you think of ITDR and supply chain, we're looking at hardware. We're looking at how much stuff we have in our DR site and like the physical servers that we're going to need to do this. So I think it's a little different in terms of you can apply those loss types to ITDR. They just look differently.
That's an interesting point that you just brought up, the difference between su supply chain on the business side, who's looking at you whoever's sending them whatever, an application or
Sure.
things like that. And but from an IT perspective, it's very different. And it's like they're two different groups, but yet the supply chain could bounce back
Impact
and
both.
forth between the two. And so if you're on the business side and you're transitioning to IT, I guess part of that is to, because you mentioned earlier on the same terminology and vocabulary, is getting that same understanding on that stage as well, not just understanding what IP means or some other acronym, but also the processes that support the rest of the business as well.
For sure. I think an easier way to sometimes approach it is using a framework you're already familiar with, and then looking at that space and how it would be impacted by a similar framework as you might have leveraged in BC on the business side.
Hmm. TJ, do you have anything to say about that? Because you said you started off on IT and went all over the place.
Yeah, it was more of like the frog boiling in the pot thing. Like it kind of happened before I realized what was happening. Like I was getting pulled more into the BC side of things. Um, I, I think Aubrey did a great job covering it. I can't really think of anything else that jumps to mind. It's, I mean, I know we're going to touch on it, but there's the domain specific stuff as well, that starts to separate things out. There's the domain specific knowledge that you have for the ITDR side versus the BC side. So like, I know BC professionals who are like, they are an expert in doing BIAs, or they're an expert in plan creation, or doing a deep dive with it. Like, hey, the finance team needs help with something continuity related. Okay, cool. That person's going to do a deep dive on finance. And then you build those domain specific skills so that even within your team, it's like, well, Alex and Aubrey, you both know Gail, my counterpart here at Netflix. Um, yeah, if it's studio related, like absolutely Gail is the guy. Now I can speak somewhat intelligently about the studio side as well, but Gail has done a lot more work with that side of the house. So he's built that domain specific knowledge that, cool, you do that, I can step in as needed, and then he can also step in on the technology side if I'm unavailable for some reason. That same mindset applies to the ITDR side as well.
I like what you were saying there because I know we're talking about transitioning from BCM to a technical role, but I think there's another opportunity when that happens, and that's to teach IT some of what you're bringing, about the business as well. To your point, TJ, you may have specialities, but at the same time, they're educating you so you can transition to a business continuity role. But when you get there or you start being in that realm, you have an obligation to kind of teach them to understand the realm you just came from so that the two can work together, right?
Yeah, a lot of times engineers are just so laser focused on, I have to keep this production system up and running all the time. Like I can't be worrying about these distractions. And a lot of times initially in your ITDR career, they'll sort of like kind of try and brush you off and tell you to kind of go away, leave me alone. Um,
No, no way.
Never happens.
But if you have a foundational understanding on the BC side of things, a lot of times the BC professionals if your start was on the business side of things, you have an easier way of explaining to them, or translating for them the impact, as Aubrey was talking about before. Like if you purely, as a guy who literally came out of the data center, I had to build the business vocabulary because I didn't come from that world, but like I could step into any room with any engineer and have a deep discussion, deep technical discussion, but explaining what the impact to the business was, I had no idea. So at least if you're doing the transition this way from the business side over to the ITDR side, it can be a little bit easier to translate that for those engineers. And they're like, oh, okay, we're not just checking boxes here. It's like, oh, we have to do this because if we don't do this and if this fails, it, it means this specific thing to the business. And at that point, it plugs that together for them.
Did you experience that and go through that, Aubrey?
Yeah, and I would say there's even more to it if you're really lucky, which I was, which is that you can take those business requirements and look at what DR is capable of and see what engineers have wanted to do this whole time. They're like, oh man, I wish we had a better solution for this. Like, I wish this were more agile or flexible or resilient or available. We've never invested in HA. And you say, well, actually there's this business need and you have a gap and we can raise this risk and even potentially get funding to rebuild this thing the right way. It's not anybody's fault. Like I think placing blame is the wrong thing to do. You can say, hey, we built this thing, it wasn't that important when we built it, but now it is really important. We've added all these like requirements to it and the business is using it more. I'm thinking of bots particularly, or like business owned applications, like things that the really smartest guy in the room built to serve a need that then have become hyper important to the business. And you can help build the bridge to create the visibility so you can make it better for both the engineers and the business, because you can help highlight those discrepancies in what the thing can do in terms of resiliency and what the business needs. And I think I've seen my teams be like, oh, we've always wanted to build it that way and we've never been able to make the argument. And I think that's a value add that helps get the buy-in from the teams on both sides.
TJ, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah, I
I
want
said if you're really lucky, I caveated that because it doesn't always happen.
what Aubrey's talking about though, like jogs something loose in my brain that I, I have to admit to as a former engineer myself, like don't, and I'm speaking about this from the perspective of as you go into the ITDR space as an ITDR professional, don't get dissuaded by engineers who they're like they're just stuck in a mindset sometimes. And I apologize to all of you engineers out there. I'm not saying anything bad, but sometimes we get a little bit attached to some of our creations and the things that we've built. So it takes a little bit to jog or get them out of that mindset of like, this is the only way to do this. There are other ways to do this. So it's the counterpoint to what Aubrey was saying. But I know a lot of younger or newer ITDR professionals who they'll hit that resistance of like, oh, the engineer said this is the only way of doing this. Well, it probably isn't. That's Here's opinion is that that's the only way of doing this. But I can tell you that 90% of the time there are other ways of doing it, all with their own pros and cons, but just don't get dissuaded by that. This is a good opportunity. If you hit that resistance, pivot and go have conversations with other people in the industry. Go have other conversations with other actual engineers in that space. Put together like notes, right? And then take those notes back to the engineer. And I'd pretty well guarantee if you come with notes and facts and data, engineers probably more willing to listen to you at that point.
You both said the word opportunity. So I'm seeing as, let's say, a business continuity person transitioning to an IT role. Um, there's opportunity here for the organization to break down silos, my own personal knowledge, and creating resilience for the organization, right? There's a big opportunity here.
Yeah, I can. This is easy to talk about at Netflix because we built the methodology specifically to break down the silo, and there is almost no line in between business and technology continuity. Um, but to your point, breaking down those barriers and having people do the transition between the two and become fluent in both sides, business continuity and ITDR, those people become incredibly valuable over time to facilitate those conversations because it's like I don't know what BC's doing. Like they're just over there doing something. They're busy with their BIAs or whatever, um, and their BCPs. And yeah, in those cases, it's having both worlds. It can help make that bridge and facilitate better relationships there. And more importantly, at least again, as a data guy, hey, we can share information. Like in a lot of cases, like these information, all this information and data gets siloed in their own spaces. We could be sharing data and reducing effort on both sides of this, right? Like So
Full-heartedly agree. I think the thing I've heard from a teacher before in this space was it's a three-legged stool, like cyber, ITDR, and BC. Like they all have to be able to talk to each other and engage each other at different pieces in time for different events. And you don't always need cyber. You might need privacy and security. But it's not. I don't know anyone in the BC world who's not talking about cyber incidents, even though they don't have a whole nexus of control over what happens in the ITDR space. But knowing that and knowing recovery as opposed to like the crater in the ground, as opposed to some kind of malicious intent, like that's a whole different conversation. And it's a conversation that the businesses are interested in having. And it's something that ITDR has to account for, even though they're not cybersecurity, they're responsible for part of that recovery. And it looks different. And the business needs to understand that too, which brings BC in. So all of that cross-functional work is happening because we are so reliant on technology now. I don't know any business except Waffle House maybe that can get away from technology in their day-to-day work. You guys can tell me if I'm missing something later on LinkedIn, but a lot of these a lot of us are just we're in trouble if we don't have it. We're so used to having it, and so the business needs technology. Technology needs ITDR, and we all need to be able to talk to each other. And having this skill set is, I think, super valuable to anybody who's interested in pursuing it.
Yes, agreed.
yeah, that interconnectedness, I think we're sort of at an inflection point now, especially how technology enabled almost all companies are, not all companies, but most large companies. Um, you can't have these silos anymore because you have to have a comprehensive understanding of like how resilient are we, or how resilient do we need to be, and then how resilient are we, whether it's a business continuity side or ITDR side, and the interplay between those two things. It's and even I was thinking hard when you mentioned Waffle House. I was like, I bet their shipment system, their supply chain system is almost entirely automated and IT driven.
Unless
So
they have chickens in the back. I doubt
yeah,
it.
um, yeah, I think we're getting closer and closer to a point where, look, if you're a leader and you're listening to this, um, hey, go find out. Like honestly, go find out how close your ITDR and BC teams are working together. And if they're not, like you need to be asking some hard questions.
Yeah, agreed. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We're talking with Aubrey Wade and TJ Mead today about transitioning our business continuity roles into a more technical role. And I'm going to let you both know, I'm going to ask you about some of the challenges we should be ready to face if we want to make this change. We will be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.